The wind carried a dry, restless whisper across the desert as the sun sank behind the distant red mesas. Evening settled over the small frontier village like an old blanket, heavy, familiar, and worn at the edges. The ranch stood alone on the edge of the valley, its fences bent with time, its roof patched with tin that glinted faintly in the dying light. Coyotes called in the distance, their cries echoing through the empty land where silence was almost sacred. Inside the corral, the horses stirred uneasily, hooves shifting in the dust as if they too felt something unusual in the air that night. The Apache rancher sat on the porch, sharpening the same hunting knife he had carried since boyhood. His hands were scarred and strong, the skin darkened by sun and years of work. His life was a quiet one now, raising cattle, mending fences, and keeping away from the white settlers who looked at him like a shadow from a past they wanted to forget. He had long stopped explaining himself. The land spoke enough for him. As the horizon dimmed to blue, he saw a flicker of movement along the trail leading down from the canyon. Two riders, one leading a weary mule, their silhouettes long and uneven against the fading light. He narrowed his eyes, unsure whether to reach for his rifle or the lantern. Few travelers came this way anymore, and fewer still after dark. Trouble often rode under the cover of night. But as the riders drew near, he noticed their exhaustion. The slumped shoulders, the dirt-caked clothes, the slow steps of the mule carrying what looked like an injured man. They stopped at the fence, their voices low and tired. "We only ask for shelter till morning," the older one said. His voice trembled, not from fear but from fatigue. The rancher hesitated. Strangers were a risk, yet there was something familiar in the man's eyes, though he couldn't place it. He finally nodded. "You can rest in the barn," he said, his voice steady but distant. "Water's in the trough. There's stew inside if you can stomach it." They thanked him quietly, helping the wounded man down from the mule. The rancher watched them for a moment, three figures moving through the dust like ghosts of an older story. Then he turned back toward the porch, but unease sat heavy in his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that these travelers carried something more than tired bones and dusty clothes. Inside, the smell of beans and smoke filled the cabin. The rancher stirred the pot absently, listening to the soft shuffle of the strangers outside. When he finally brought the lantern to the barn, he found them settled among the hay. The younger one, a woman perhaps in her 20s, looked up quickly when the light fell across her face. Her eyes were sharp yet gentle, the kind that had seen hardship but still held some quiet defiance. The wounded man lay beside her, his arm bandaged with strips of cloth torn from a faded coat. "You came a long way," the rancher said, setting the lantern on a beam. She nodded. "We were trying to reach the river crossing before nightfall. Didn't make it." He studied her face. There was something haunting in her voice, a trace of fear and memory. "There's no one left at that crossing," he told her softly. "Army cleared the camp years ago." Her gaze faltered, but she didn't answer. The rancher noticed the small amulet hanging around her neck, woven from horsehair and beads in a pattern he knew well. It was Apache work, old and sacred. His heart tightened. He hadn't seen one like it since he was a boy. When he left the barn, the wind had turned cold, sweeping through the valley with a sound like whispers of the dead. He sat by the fire again, trying to recall where he had seen that woman's face before. Memories drifted in fragments. The river, a storm, and a small hand reaching toward him through the smoke of a burning wagon. He pushed the thought aside, telling himself it was nothing but the tricks of memory. Midnight came quietly. The stars burned clear above the desert sky. From the barn came the sound of restless movement, a groan and the creak of wood. The rancher rose, his instincts prickling. He took his rifle and stepped outside, boots crunching softly against the frost-hardened earth. When he opened the barn door, the scene froze him in place. The woman stood there, her shawl fallen from her shoulders, revealing a deep scar that ran along her collarbone, the same kind he had once seen years ago during the war. She held the amulet tightly in her fist. The wounded man was awake, his face pale under the lantern glow, his features marked with a quiet pain that spoke of more than injury. "You remember me," the woman said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. The rancher's grip on his rifle loosened. "I'm not sure what you mean." "You should," she replied. "Years ago, near the San Pedro Canyon, you were barely alive when we found you. My father carried you to our camp. You would have died before sunrise if we hadn't hidden you from the patrol." The world seemed to tilt around him. The fire in his chest, the smell of wet earth, the echo of soldiers' shouts, all of it came rushing back. He remembered crawling through the mud, the taste of blood in his mouth, the faint sound of a woman's voice whispering in a language he barely understood. He had never known who they were or why they had saved him, only that when he woke, his wounds were bound, and the camp was gone. He looked at her now, realization dawning like slow dawn after a storm. "You were the girl," he said under his breath. "The one who sang by the river." She gave a faint nod, eyes glistening in the light. "My father didn't live to see you heal." The soldiers came back. The silence stretched between them, filled with old ghosts and debts that could never be repaid. He lowered the rifle, his heart heavy with gratitude and sorrow. "You could have left me there," he said quietly. "We don't leave the wounded," she answered simply. "Even when they wear another man's uniform." He looked at her wounded companion. "And now you come to my door in need." She met his eyes. "Fate turns circles, doesn't it?" He felt the weight of it all, the years, the scars, the quiet justice of the desert. The old world had long stopped caring who owed what to whom, but the land remembered. It always did. As dawn began to pale the horizon, he stood watching the barn door, unsure what the coming light would bring. He knew only that something had shifted inside him, something long buried under the years of solitude and silence. Behind him, the fire crackled low, and the wind carried the distant sound of hooves. Too many for comfort. Maybe soldiers, maybe bounty hunters. Whoever they were heading this way. The rancher turned toward the sound, jaw tightening. The past he thought he'd buried was riding straight toward his land, and inside his barn rested the very people who had once saved his life. He took a slow breath and reached for his hat. The time for quiet living was over. The night had returned an old debt, and before sunrise, he'd have to decide just how far he'd go to repay it. The coyotes cried again in the hills, and the first streak of light broke through the clouds, casting long shadows over the ranch where fate had finally come home. The morning light spilled slowly over the valley, painting the land in muted gold. The air was crisp, holding that quiet before the day begins, the kind that belonged to ranchers, wanderers, and ghosts who still hadn't left this part of the frontier. The Apache rancher stood at the fence line, his hand resting on the weathered wood, eyes fixed on the horizon where dust had risen hours ago. He knew it wasn't just wind. Whoever was coming was close, maybe an hour away. The world always had a way of circling back, and today it seemed his past was finally catching up. Behind him, the barn stood silent except for the faint rustle of straw and the soft breathing of the strangers. He hadn't told them about the riders yet. He wasn't sure who they were, but the sound of many hooves in the night usually meant men who carried trouble with them. Soldiers, bounty hunters, or worse. Out here, Law came on horseback and left with bodies. He turned toward the barn and walked slowly, boots crunching over the cold dirt. The woman was awake, tending the fire she had built from broken boards. Her companion slept near the door, the faint color returning to his face. She looked up as the rancher entered, the same calm but wary expression on her face. "They're coming," he said simply. Her eyes widened just a little. "Who?" "Don't know yet, but they're riding hard. Could be the army." She glanced toward her injured friend, her lips tightening. "If it's them, they'll kill him." "Why?" the rancher asked quietly. "Because he's wanted. He deserted a patrol near Fort Mason. They burned a village down there, our village." Her voice trembled slightly, but she kept it steady. He couldn't follow their orders anymore. The rancher studied her face, his jaw tightening. The name Fort Mason carried memories he had tried to bury. Years ago, soldiers had come from there to wipe out Apache camps in the hills. The army had called it clearing the frontier. His people called it something else. He knew what it meant to lose a home in one night, to watch everything you love go up in smoke. He nodded slowly. "Then you'll stay here till nightfall. After that, I'll show you a path through the canyon. It's old and narrow, but it'll take you past the ridge unseen." Her eyes softened with gratitude. "You'd risk that for us?" He hesitated. "You once did the same for me." The wind shifted, bringing the faint echo of shouting from beyond the hills. He looked toward the sound. The riders were closer, maybe half a mile now. He went to the corral, saddling his horse, an old gray with scars across its flank. Every motion was practiced, tightening the straps, checking the rifle, tying his knife to the saddle horn. The woman followed him, her shawl pulled tight against the wind. "You should go now," he said. "Take him and leave while there's time." She shook her head. "He can't ride, not yet. And I won't leave him." There was steel in her voice that reminded him of someone. His mother, maybe, or the healer woman who once stood between soldiers and children with nothing but prayer and courage. The same kind of strength that didn't ask permission to exist. The rancher sighed, running a hand down the horse's neck. Then we wait. But you'll need to tell me everything. If they're after him, I need to know why. She hesitated, then spoke quietly. After the raid, we hid in the canyons. For weeks, we watched them patrol, burning every camp they found. He was part of it, but he started bringing food to those left behind. One night, they caught him. His captain ordered him shot for treason, but he escaped. Since then, they've been hunting him like an animal. The rancher's eyes darkened. And you? I was the one who helped him escape, she said. He saved my little brother that night. I owed him. The story hung between them, heavy and fragile. The rancher understood debts. He had lived his life under one, the debt of being alive when others weren't. And now, once again, the land had brought back the faces of the past to remind him that mercy carried its own weight. By midday, the riders had arrived at the far end of the valley. The rancher watched from the ridge above his corral. There were 6 of them, armed and dressed in the tan coats of cavalry scouts. The man leading them wore a broad hat and a pistol on each hip. His horse was tall and black, its gait sharp and restless. From that distance, the rancher could see their purpose. They weren't here for trade or water. They were hunting. When the riders reached the fence, the leader called out, "You there! Apache! Seen anyone pass through this way? We're tracking fugitives." The rancher kept his tone even. "Ain't seen much more than wind and dust." The leader dismounted slowly, his boots thudding against the ground. He looked around, eyes sharp as a hawk's. "That barn looks lived in." "I keep my horses there," the rancher replied. "Mind if we take a look?" "I do." The man's hand moved toward his holster. "You giving orders now?" The rancher didn't move. His voice stayed calm but carried a warning. "You step on my land without cause, I'll treat it as trespass. Army or not." A tense silence followed. The soldiers shifted uneasily, sensing the edge in the air. The leader finally smirked. "You Apaches always did have a hard time learning where your place was." He spat on the ground and turned back to his horse. "We'll camp by the creek. If you see anyone, you'll tell us, or we'll come back and search this place ourselves." They rode off slowly, their laughter echoing behind them. The rancher waited until they disappeared over the hill before heading back to the barn. Inside, the woman stood ready with a pistol in her hand, eyes wide. "They're gone?" For now, he could see the fear in her face and something else, determination. She had that look people carried when they had already lost everything once and refused to lose again. "They'll be back by nightfall," he said. "We'll need to move before then." Her gaze shifted to her wounded companion. "He can't walk far." "Then I'll make them chase me instead," the rancher said quietly. "You'll slip out through the old trail. Once you reach the ridge, follow the stars west till you hit the river." She shook her head. "No, you'll die if they catch you." "I've died once before," he said, a small, tired smile crossing his face. "You brought me back then. Maybe it's time I pay that debt." She looked away, her jaw trembling. "I never meant for you to be dragged into this." "Maybe the land meant it," he replied. "Out here, nothing happens by accident." The afternoon wore on heavy with waiting. The woman helped the wounded man sit up, feeding him water from a tin cup. The rancher gathered supplies quietly. A saddlebag, some dried meat, extra cartridges. Every small sound seemed louder than it should be. The silence between them was filled with things that didn't need saying. When the sun began to dip again, the rancher looked out across the valley. The riders' campfire smoke rose faintly in the distance. He could hear faint laughter carried on the wind. Somewhere, a hawk cried high above. He turned back to her one last time. "When the sky goes red, that's when you leave. Don't look back. What about you?" "I'll give them something else to follow." She stepped closer, her hand brushing his sleeve, a quiet plea in her eyes. "Why help us?" He met her gaze steadily. "Because once someone helped me when I was no one, and maybe the only thing a man can do with his life is pass that mercy forward." The light outside shifted, throwing long shadows across the barn floor. The wind rose again, carrying the scent of smoke and dust. Somewhere out there, the soldiers began to stir, their campfires dying out as they readied to ride again. The rancher pulled his hat low and led his horse out into the dusk. The woman watched him go, her heart pounding with fear and gratitude tangled together. As he mounted, she called softly, "What's your name?" He paused, his hand resting on the saddle horn. "Names don't matter much in a land that forgets its own people," he said. "But if I don't come back, tell the river I kept my word." He kicked the horse forward, riding into the deepening night as the sky turned the color of blood and fire. Behind him, the wind swallowed his tracks. and the sound of approaching hooves grew louder in the distance, closing in fast, like a storm that had been waiting too long to break. The sun had long dropped below the ridgeline when the first shot cracked through the stillness of the valley. The sound echoed like a warning from the old world, sharp, distant, and final. The Apache rancher pressed low against his horse's neck, spurring it through the narrow gulch where mesquite and scrub oak clung to the rocks. The wind whipped through his hair as dust stung his eyes. He could hear the riders behind him now, their voices carrying through the canyon loud and angry. They had taken the bait faster than he expected. The plan was simple: draw them away long enough for the woman and her wounded companion to vanish into the hills. But simple plans rarely stayed that way in a land that thrived on chaos. He guided his horse toward a dry riverbed that cut through the earth like a scar, remembering every bend and shadow from years of hunting here. The moonlight glinted off the rifle slung across his shoulder. He wasn't planning to kill anyone if he could help it, but men like those didn't stop chasing until blood was spilled. The desert didn't allow much mercy. Back at the ranch, the woman had done as he said. She packed what little they had, bread, a canteen, her father's old knife, and helped the injured man onto the mule. His face was pale, jaw clenched from pain, but he refused to slow her down. "He's out there because of me," he said, voice breaking. "He shouldn't face them alone." "You'll only die if you go after him," she replied firmly, tightening the reins. "He's giving us time. Don't waste it." They rode quietly through the tall grass that shimmered under the starlight, following the ridge that curved north toward the canyon pass. Every step the mule took sounded too loud. Every gust of wind felt like it carried the whispers of men hunting them. The woman glanced back once and saw the faint glow of lanterns moving in the valley below. The riders were spreading out. She gripped the knife tighter. In the canyon, the rancher dismounted, leading his horse up a steep path between two large boulders. He knew this place well. It was where his tribe once camped before they were forced away. Old symbols were still carved into the stone, half buried under lichen. He paused for a breath, running his hand along one mark, a circle with an arrow breaking through it. It meant survival. His father had taught him that when he was a boy. The sound of hooves snapped him back. He crouched low behind a rock as two riders appeared below, their torches casting moving shadows. "You see him?" one called. "Nah, but the bastard's close. Horse prints lead straight through here." They stopped to check the ground. The rancher waited until one dismounted, his rifle resting on his shoulder, the other scanning the ridge with a lantern. Then, with steady breath, he raised his weapon and fired once. The lantern shattered, throwing them into darkness. Before they could return fire, he whistled sharply. His horse, trained from years of Apache raids, bolted down the opposite slope, hooves striking stones and sending up a cloud of dust. The riders turned and fired toward the sound. By the time they realized the trick, the rancher was already gone, vanishing deeper into the canyon's shadow. He kept riding until the sound of pursuit faded. Then he stopped, listening to the desert. Only the wind answered him. The silence should have been comforting, but instead it felt heavy. He looked up at the stars and wondered if the woman had made it past the ridge. Far behind him, the soldiers regrouped. Their leader was furious, his voice slicing through the night. "He's alone! One man can't outrun us forever. Split up. I want that Apache dead before dawn." But one of his men hesitated. "Sir, what if he ain't the one we're after?" "We were told to find a deserter, not some ranch hand." The leader's jaw tightened. "You think I care? That deserter's probably hiding with him. These people protect their own. You kill one, you smoke out the rest." The men looked at each other but said nothing. Orders were orders. Meanwhile, the woman and the wounded man reached the narrow trail that cut into the mountains. The mule stumbled but kept moving. The man's breathing had grown shallow. She knew he was losing strength. When they finally stopped to rest, she knelt beside him and tried to clean his wound again, using what little water she had left. "You should have left me," he whispered. "You could have gone faster." "I told you before, I don't leave people behind," she said softly. "Not after what I've seen." Her eyes flicked toward the dark horizon. Somewhere out there, the rancher was risking everything for them. She barely knew his name, yet he was fighting like he had something to prove. Maybe he did. Back in the canyon, the rancher found shelter beneath an overhang. His horse was tired, foam streaking its sides. He rubbed its neck gently, murmuring words in his native tongue, words his mother used to whisper when storms rolled in. He thought about the woman's face, the scar on her collarbone, the amulet around her neck. The memories it stirred were sharper now. He could almost hear the cries from that night long ago, the burning wagons, the river swollen with rain. Her father's voice shouting to run. He hadn't known who saved him then, but fate had brought the answer to his doorstep. Now it demanded something in return. He didn't see the figure behind him until it was too late. A shadow moved near the rocks, a soldier quiet and patient, rifle raised. The click of metal reached his ears a second before the shot. The rancher dropped flat as the bullet slammed into stone beside him. He rolled, drew his knife and lunged before the man could reload. The struggle was silent but fierce, two bodies locked in dust and sweat. The soldier's hand clutched his throat, the rancher's knife pressed against his chest. "Why chase me?" he growled through his teeth. "What's worth dying for out here?" The soldier spat blood. "Orders." The rancher hesitated just long enough for the man to shove him back. They both staggered to their feet, breathing hard. The soldier swung the butt of his rifle, catching the rancher across the jaw. Pain burst through his skull, but he didn't fall. Instead, he tackled the man into the sand and struck until the world went still again. He stood over the body, chest heaving, his hands shaking not from rage but from memory. He'd promised himself long ago never to kill again unless forced. The desert, it seemed, had its own opinion about promises. He dragged the body under the rocks, covered it with brush, and took the soldier's water flask. Then he mounted his horse once more, heading north. He couldn't let the others find the woman, not after everything she'd already lost. The night stretched long and cold. The woman and her companion had reached the mouth of the canyon, but the sound of distant hooves warned them the chase wasn't over. She urged the mule forward, whispering, "Just a little more." But the wounded man groaned and slipped from the saddle. She caught him before he hit the ground, holding him close. "They're coming," he said weakly. "Leave me, please." "No," she said through clenched teeth. "We live or die together." She pulled him behind a fallen log as torchlight flickered between the rocks below. The riders were sweeping the area, calling out, "Search the ridge!" They couldn't have gone far. She held her breath, clutching the knife to her chest. One wrong move, one snapped branch, and it would all be over. Then, faintly, another sound echoed from deeper in the valley. A rifle shot, followed by the wild cry of a horse. The soldiers turned toward it instantly, shouting orders and riding away. The woman exhaled shakily, tears slipping down her cheeks. She knew who had fired that shot. He was still out there, still fighting to keep them safe. Dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. The rancher rode through the sagebrush, blood drying on his sleeve, exhaustion pulling at his bones. But he didn't stop. Somewhere behind him, the army was regrouping. Somewhere ahead, 2 lives depended on him reaching them first. He glanced once at the horizon, where the light turned the desert into gold again. For a moment, he thought of his old home, the laughter of his people before the soldiers came, the sound of his father's drum echoing through the canyon walls. Those memories had haunted him for years, but now, for the first time, they didn't feel like ghosts. They felt like purpose. The land was the same as it had always been, beautiful, brutal, and alive with secrets. And as long as he drew breath, he would protect what was left of it, even if that meant vanishing into its silence once more. The sound of horses came again from behind, closer this time. He turned in the saddle, eyes narrowing. The chase wasn't over, not yet. The story of his life, and theirs, was still being written in the dust of the old American frontier, where every man's fate was carried by the wind and paid for in silence. The first light of morning came crawling slow over the valley, pale and cold, brushing the ridges with silver. The Apache rancher's horse trembled beneath him, tired from running all night. His coat was streaked with dust, his muscles quivering from strain. The rancher could feel his own body giving in too, but he pushed forward, eyes scanning the ridgeline ahead. Somewhere beyond those rocks, the woman and her wounded companion were still moving, or trying to. He prayed they hadn't been caught in the night. Behind him, the sound of pursuit returned, faint but steady. 6 riders had become 4 now, but they were closing the distance. He could hear the metallic clatter of bridles, the barked orders of the man leading them, the same cruel tone that used to echo through camps before gunfire. The rancher gritted his teeth, knowing he couldn't outrun them forever. The canyon walls were too open now, the ground too flat to hide tracks. He reached the top of a ridge and looked down into the basin below. The landscape stretched wide and endless, a broken riverbed twisting like a scar through the desert floor, with clusters of mesquite and dry sage scattered like old bones. In the distance, faint smoke rose from the mountainside, maybe from the woman's campfire, maybe from the soldiers' torches. Either way, he knew it would draw attention. He needed to reach her first. The horse stumbled once, nearly throwing him, but he caught the reins and steadied it. His knuckles were raw from gripping the saddle horn. He took a deep breath, tasting dust and blood on his tongue. His father's words echoed in his mind, the old Apache teaching he'd grown up hearing. The land will protect those who know how to listen. He looked at the patterns in the rocks, the way the wind moved across the grass, the faint trail of vultures circling far to the south. There was a path still waiting, narrow and dangerous, but it could work. Meanwhile, the woman had stopped by a dried-up creek to rest. The mule had gone lame, and the wounded man could barely stand. She tore a strip from her shawl, soaked it with the last of the water, and pressed it against his shoulder. His eyes fluttered open. "They're still coming?" he asked weakly. "Yes," she whispered. "But he's keeping them busy." He looked at her, his voice trembling. "He shouldn't have done that for us. He doesn't owe us anything. He said the land brought us back together," she murmured. "Maybe that means something." Her words hung in the air, fragile and uncertain. She turned her gaze toward the east where the sky burned orange over the mountains. Somewhere out there, a single man was holding back the fury of 6 armed soldiers, risking everything for 2 strangers. She couldn't understand why, but she felt a strange pull toward him. Something deeper than gratitude. Something old and unfinished. The rancher rode hard through the basin, cutting across the dry riverbed where the ground was soft enough to mask tracks. He dismounted near a cluster of rocks and crouched low, listening. The hoofbeats were louder now, close, maybe half a mile. He saw the dust rise from behind a line of juniper trees. The riders had split into 2 groups again, one circling north, the other pushing straight through the basin. He knew they meant to trap him. He raised his rifle, aiming through the scope toward the nearest rider. The man wore the same tan coat and brass buttons, the same insignia that had once marked the soldiers who burned his village. His breath slowed. The sound of his heartbeat filled the silence. He could take the shot and disappear, but that would bring the others faster. He needed something else, a distraction big enough to throw them off completely. He tied his horse to a rock and began climbing the ridge. Halfway up, he found a narrow ledge overlooking the basin. From there, he could see everything. The soldiers below, the winding trail the woman would have to take, and the approaching storm clouds gathering over the horizon. The wind was changing, blowing hard from the north. A sign, he thought. The land was still on his side. The soldiers reached the basin moments later, their leader shouting orders. "Fan out! He's around here somewhere! Find him before he hits the pass." The rancher moved fast, silent as the wind shifting between the rocks. He picked up a small stone and threw it down into the ravine. The noise made 2 riders turn sharply, guns drawn. That was all he needed. He slipped behind another ridge, sprinted across the slope, and fired once toward a dried tree trunk. The shot echoed through the canyon, sounding farther away than it was. The soldiers chased the sound instantly, but the leader, smarter than the rest, didn't move. He stayed still, eyes scanning the ridge, and when he finally saw the faint glint of metal, he smiled. "I see you," he whispered. The next moment, a bullet tore through the rock near the rancher's head. Dust exploded in his face as he dropped flat. He rolled, fired twice, then ducked behind a boulder. The echo of gunfire rolled across the valley like thunder. The horses screamed. The leader shouted, "Flank him! Don't let him get to the ridge!" The rancher reloaded fast, breathing hard. His left arm burned from a grazing wound, blood trickling down to his wrist. The pain didn't matter. He waited for the right sound, the rustle of boots on gravel, the shadow that moved just a heartbeat too soon. And when it came, he swung around and fired. A man fell. The others cursed and ducked for cover, the air filled with the smell of gunpowder and dust. He could feel the tension winding tighter, every second pulling him closer to the edge. He wasn't just fighting for himself now. Somewhere beyond the canyon, 2 lives depended on what he did here. Miles away, the woman was leading the wounded man through a patch of juniper trees when she heard the faint echo of gunfire. Her heart sank. She knew it was him. Every shot felt like a knife twisting deeper inside her chest. She wanted to go back, but the man grabbed her wrist. "Don't," he said weakly. "If you go back, it'll all be for nothing." Tears stung her eyes. "He'll die out there." "Maybe," the man said softly. "But if he does, it's because he believes something's worth saving." The words hit her harder than the wind. She looked up toward the sky where storm clouds gathered heavy and dark. Thunder rolled in the distance. The desert was about to turn wild. Back in the canyon, the rancher's rifle clicked empty. He dropped it, pulled his knife, and crouched low. The leader's voice rang out again. "You're a hard man to kill, Apache, but no one outruns the army forever." The rancher said nothing. He waited until the man stepped closer, his boots crunching over the rocks, his pistol raised. The rancher's eyes darted to the side, where the storm winds had begun to sweep through the canyon, pushing loose sand in swirling gusts. He smiled faintly. The land was speaking again. When the first flash of lightning split the sky, the rancher moved. He lunged from behind the rock, slamming into the man and knocking the pistol from his hand. They tumbled down the slope, rolling through the dust and stones. The leader cursed, swinging wildly, but the rancher's blade caught his arm. The man screamed, grabbed a handful of dirt and threw it into the rancher's face. For a moment, everything went white. The soldier scrambled to his feet, bleeding but grinning. "You should have stayed on your ranch," he hissed, raising his pistol again. The rancher blinked away the grit, his breathing rough. The lightning flashed again, and behind the soldier the canyon seemed to come alive, shadows shifting, the echo of hooves, the scent of rain hitting dry earth. The air buzzed with energy. The rancher could feel the storm closing in, the same kind of storm that had once saved his life long ago. The soldier cocked his pistol. "Any last words?" But the rancher didn't answer. He was watching the horizon, where the woman now appeared, silhouetted against the rising wind, standing beside the wounded man who leaned on her shoulder. She must have turned back. The sight froze him, filling his chest with dread and something fierce. The soldier followed his gaze, his grin widening. "Well now, looks like we'll finish this all at once." The rain began to fall then, slow, heavy drops that hit the dust and turned it dark. The sky cracked open above them. The wind howled through the canyon, swallowing every sound but the beating of hooves and the rising thunder. The rancher took one last breath, muscles tensed, eyes locked on the man before him. Every choice, every memory, every debt owed had led to this moment. The desert watched in silence as lightning tore through the clouds again, lighting up the world in blinding white. And then, everything moved at once. The soldier raised his gun, the woman screamed his name, and the storm came roaring down, carrying the fury of the land itself. The story hadn't ended yet, but the next breath would decide who would live to see the dawn. The storm broke like the world had been waiting to breathe again. Rain came in sheets, blurring the canyon, washing away the blood and the dust. The thunder rolled like cannon fire, drowning out the echo of the gunshot that followed. When the sound faded, the rancher stood still, chest heaving, water streaming down his face. The soldier lay motionless a few feet away, his pistol half buried in mud. The rancher's knife was gone, swept somewhere down the rocks by the rushing water. He couldn't tell if the ringing in his ears was thunder or the sound of everything finally coming to an end. He turned toward the ridge where the woman stood. The wind had nearly torn her shawl away and her hair clung to her face in wet strands. The wounded man leaned on her, pale but alive. She stared at the scene below, her breath caught between fear and disbelief. The rancher met her eyes for a brief second through the rain, and though no words passed, she understood what he had done. The storm howled louder, pushing him back as he climbed toward her. When he finally reached the top, his legs shook from exhaustion. She ran forward and caught his arm before he stumbled. "It's over," she whispered, though her voice trembled as if she didn't quite believe it herself. He nodded weakly, wiping blood from his cheek. For now. They found a small cave at the base of the ridge and waited out the storm. The air smelled of wet stone and lightning. The wounded man lay on a bed of hay the woman gathered from the mules' packs. The rancher sat near the entrance, staring at the rain falling outside. Each drop shimmered like silver in the dim light. He said nothing for a long time. The woman knelt beside the fire, coaxing small flames to life with her last dry match. "You killed him, didn't you?" she asked softly. He hesitated. "He left me no choice." She looked down at her hands. "Do you ever wonder if the land remembers all the blood we spill?" He glanced at her, the flicker of firelight reflecting in his dark eyes. "It does. That's why it still rains when it should have forgotten how." The storm lasted through most of the night. When dawn came, the desert was quiet again, the air clean and heavy with the scent of sage. They buried the soldier beneath a flat stone at the edge of the ridge. The rancher didn't say a prayer. He didn't know any that fit. But he covered the grave with care, the same way he once covered his father's back when the shooting stopped years ago. The woman stood beside him, her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. The wounded man watched silently from a distance, one arm in a makeshift sling. When it was done, they rode down into the valley. The sky stretched clear and blue above them, the storm having swept away every trace of what had happened. The rancher led the way, his horse slow and steady, the woman following close behind with the mule. The air was cooler now, the sunlight softer, like the land itself was trying to start over. By midday, they reached the ranch again. It stood the same as before, the fence half broken, the porch creaking, smoke still faintly curling from the chimney. Yet it felt different now, as if it carried the weight of everything that had happened in those few short days. The rancher dismounted and looked around. The corral gate swung gently in the wind. The horses inside snorted, restless but unharmed. Somehow, despite the chaos, this small piece of land had survived. The woman helped the injured man down from the mule and guided him toward the porch. He sat on the steps, staring out at the endless stretch of desert. For the first time, his expression wasn't full of pain, just quiet understanding. The rancher handed him a tin cup of water and sat beside him. "You should rest here a while," he said. "There's food in the cellar and blankets inside." The man looked at him with weary gratitude. "You've done enough already." "We won't forget it," the rancher shook his head. "You don't owe me anything. Just heal, then go where the land takes you." The woman came to stand behind them. "And you? What will you do?" He glanced toward the hills where the sun was rising higher. "Fix what's broken. Maybe mend the fence. Feed the horses. That's all a man can really do." Her eyes softened. "You could come with us. We're heading west once he's strong enough. There's land beyond the river where no one asks questions." He smiled faintly, but there was a sadness behind it. "I've crossed enough rivers in my life. This place is where I belong." She didn't argue. She knew he was right. Some men were meant to wander, and others were meant to guard the places everyone else had forgotten. The wind brushed past them, carrying the faint scent of rain and dust, the smell of endings and beginnings. They stayed 2 more nights. The woman helped clean the barn and patch the roof. The rancher cooked what little food they had left, and though the meals were simple, they shared them in silence that felt like peace. On the 3rd morning, the wounded man could stand again and the horses were ready. The rancher saddled one for them and tied the mule behind. The woman walked up to him as the sun touched the edge of the horizon. "If you ever ride west," she said, "you'll find us near the riverbank with a small cabin and an open door." He nodded once. "And if the land ever turns cruel again," he said quietly, "you'll know how to listen to it." She smiled, though her eyes were wet. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out the amulet she always wore, the one woven from horsehair and beads. She held it out to him. "It belonged to my father. I think it's yours now." He looked at it, hesitated, then took it gently. The beads felt warm from her hand. "I'll keep it safe," he said. "I know you will." She mounted the horse and turned toward the trail. The wounded man followed slowly, tipping his hat in quiet farewell. The rancher stood by the fence, watching them ride away until they became 2 small figures against the vast, glowing desert. The wind stirred the grass around him, carrying the faint sound of hooves long after they disappeared. When they were gone, he turned back toward the porch. The house creaked as he stepped inside. Everything was still. The smell of smoke, the old wooden floor, the knife he'd left by the table. He set the amulet there, beside the lantern, where the morning light could touch it. Then he sat down and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding for years. The silence of the land wasn't empty anymore. It was full of memory. The faces of those who had come and gone, the storms that had passed, the voices of the past carried on the wind. He closed his eyes for a moment, hearing his father's drum again, faint and steady, like a heartbeat beneath the earth. Outside, the sky stretched wide and endless, blue as freedom. The land had seen enough blood and fire, enough loss to last lifetimes, but for the first time, it felt alive again, washed clean by the rain. The Apache rancher stood and stepped out onto the porch, looking across the desert that had once broken him and now seemed to forgive. He whispered a quiet promise to the wind, not to forget, but to live. Then he put his hat back on, walked toward the corral and began mending the fence 1 post at a time. The land was still rough, the world still hard, but morning had come, and that was enough. Somewhere far off, a hawk cried above the canyon, circling high where the clouds drifted. The day stretched ahead, endless and open. The rancher smiled faintly, his shadow long in the rising light. The storm was over, and though the scars remained, they no longer felt like wounds. They felt like the story of a man who had learned that even in a land built on dust and sorrow, mercy could still take root and grow again.